I've gone and successfully swapped in the 02Q 6-speed. It was kind of a pain, and I did not record it. But a couple things to know. A lot of people say that removing the subframe makes things easier. I believe that may definitely be true, but I did not remove the subframe. I did not want to have to reinstall the subframe and align it and so forth. What helped a lot was to remove the passenger side output shaft flange, because that would get hung up on the flywheel. And then secondly, have a helper. Lowering the driver's side of the engine by quite a bit so that it's really angled. That in conjunction with having somebody pull towards the front of the car, that helped a lot. So with the 6-speed, you're going to need a new flywheel and clutch for a 6-speed transmission. And it's important to note that the 2.5-liter engine has a 6-bolt flywheel, and so you'll need a 6-bolt flywheel, and they used a 6-bolt flywheel for the FSI engines, not the TSIs. So that's going to be pretty much, in the US at least, any of the 2-liter turbos from 2006 to 2009 or 2000, I believe. Yeah, it's the Mark 5s for many of them. So I actually have a transmission from an 06 Jetta GLI. And with the flywheel, you're going to want new flywheel bolts. Those are one-time, you want to replace those, and the torque value on those is 60 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. I like to mark it with a paint pen to see that 90 degrees, and you want to tighten those in a kind of diagonal fashion like lug nuts. And then the pressure plate, if it's the M7 size, the torque on that is 20 Newton meters. So I'll move the camera and show you a couple of other things that needed to be replaced as well. Nearly all of the hardware for the holding the transmission to the engine can be reused, with a couple of exceptions. So the upper mounting bolts, that is the 2 triple squares as well as the 2 starter bolts, those have a torque of 80 Newton meters or 59 foot-pounds. But something to note is the triple square bolt that is holding the Tran ATD engine on the back side here, it does fit, but the shift bracket normally that bolt is a combination bolt. So there's the larger part that holds the transmission to the engine, and then there's another thread. It's actually double-sided bolt that will then allow the transmission shift bracket to be bolted there as well. So instead I only am able to hold it down in 2 places. I was not able to find a suitable double-ended bolt because this bolt is longer than the 6-speed bolt, so I could not just use that. Moving on to the things that you'll need to replace. You can barely see it back there, but this here is where the master cylinder is, and you can see this is where the clutch line connects. You will need a new clutch line, and don't forget to grab a bottle of DOT4 brake fluid, because you'll need to bleed your clutch system. And something else to note, I was thinking about just getting some hydraulic line cut and fit, but the fittings for the clutch line are not standardized. They're Volkswagen connector, unfortunately. You also should replace this transmission mount. The stock mount, as you can see, has only 2 bolts which hold it to the transmission. This one here has 3, as you can see. And if your transmission for some reason doesn't come with one, you'll also need this bracket that's between the transmission mount and the transmission itself. And then while you're at it, you'll want to replace all of these bolts. There's one back here hiding, actually, so there's 3 on the bracket, there's 3 holding the bracket to the mount, and there's 4 holding the mount to the frame. These are all torque to yield bolts, and they should be replaced. The 4 bolts that hold the transmission mount to the body, the torque for those is 40 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. These here, the bracket and the mounts to the transmission, those are all 60 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. Those are a 18 millimeter head, whereas these are a 16mm head. Every time that you torque a bolt to yield, and that's a fatigue cycle, so it's a lot of stress on it and you're weakening it. I've heard stories of people reusing these and a couple months down the road they snap and your engine's on the ground. So it's cheap insurance, they're about $1.50 a pop, so you might as well replace those. One more note, accessing the bolts that hold the mount to the frame is kind of annoying. There's this plastic cable guide in the way, and really you just have to carefully, and by carefully I mean as carefully as you can, pull on it hard to pop it free and then push it back in place. So for some reason the parts diagram says that the shift bracket is the same between the 6-speed and the 5-speed, but it's not. This here is the shift bracket from the 5-speed. It's not even remotely the same, and it doesn't mount in the same spots. You will need a shift bracket, but the old bolts are fine to use. And like I mentioned, it'll attach in 2 places on top of the transmission, and then it should attach in a third over there using the bolt that holds the transmission to the engine, but we can't. You also will need a short throw shifter. As you can see, this one's brand new. Volkswagen actually makes one. They're standard on the European cars, and it reduces the shift throw by about 20%, which is just enough that this cable end link here will clear the engine. If you have the original one, this here will hit the engine and you won't be able to shift properly. Something to note is that on the 5-speed, the shift cables are flip-flops, so you'll have to, you have to remove these anyways to get them out of the bracket, but you'll have to flip them around so that this one here, which used to be here, is in the correct spot. Also, some people say that you can reuse the end links. In my experience, that was not the case. For me, my stock end links, the pins that they ride on were larger on this transmission, so the end links that I had would just not fit. And to remove the end links, what you do is you can actually, I'm not going to do it because it'll throw them out of adjustment, but you turn this piece here and then push it, and the spring will compress, and then you can turn it more and it'll lock in place, and then underneath it'll kind of pop apart, kind of like a drywall screw. And then as far as removing them from the bracket, there's a clip that you just have to kind of push up with a screwdriver. It'll pop out and allow the cables without the end links to slide through. Also, I forgot to mention, but the upper mount, these 2 upper mounting bolts here, like I said, have a torque value of 80 Newton meters or 59 foot-pounds. That's the same torque value as there's one bolt that passes through the engine into the transmission on the other side near the passenger side output shaft. And so that has the same torque value as those upper mounting bolts right there. You will, of course, also need a new starter. The old starter looks like it should work, and actually the bolts even line up, but the dimensions of the flywheel are a little different, so it won't actually fit. The other thing is, some people say that you need to replace the reverse light switch, the reverse light sensor. For the transmission that I had, I found that it was the same, except that there was a small washer on the threads that hold it in, so that may affect the distance a tiny bit so that it's just lining up just right. So I guess be careful with that. And then you can kind of see it right here. This is the bleeder block. If the clutch line that you have doesn't have one already on it, or if the transmission didn't also leave that on there, you will need this bleeder block as well. And something to note is there's what they call the clutch delay valve. It's just a tiny little restrictor on the inside. A lot of people like to take those out, so if you want to do that, now is the time to do it. You don't have to drill it out. All you have to do is take the bleeder block off using these clips. The clips pull up and then things just slide apart. And what you do, there's another clip holding the bleeder screw itself, bleeder nut screw piece itself in, and you pull that out and the restrictor valve will just fall right out. There's one bolt that you definitely cannot reuse, and that is this third lower mounting bolt here. It is number 4 on the diagram, if you have access to the diagram for this transmission. The factory bolt for the 02Q transmission, the 6-speed, I believe is an M10 by 105, which is much longer than the one from the 5-speed, and it does thread in, but there's only maybe a few millimeters of thread engagement, which is not enough in my opinion. So I actually went ahead and replaced it with a bolt that was not from either transmission. but I still used a Volkswagen part, and the part number for this bolt here, the one that I used, is N10773701. One last thing that's very, very important to note is that near where those two upper mounting bolts pass through, before you put the transmission on, you'll actually need to grind away some material on the transmission. There's a sharp edge where, I'll show a picture later on, but there's a sharp edge where the transmission mates with the engine, and this is a taller transmission, and there's actually a little bit more material above those mounting holes than there is on the stock 5-speed. And from other people's experiences, we know that if you don't grind away a little bit of the transmission will actually crack the timing cover on the engine, and you'll get a nice oil leak. You don't need to remove very much material, only about, people said, between 1/4 inch and 3/16. I measured it to be about 0.15 inches, and it's aluminum, so you don't need to use power tools. You can just use a file. I filed for part of it, and then I actually used a 3M Scotch-Brite clean and strip disc. It's meant for cleaning paint and mill scale off of metal, but it's just the right amount of abrasiveness to do a great job slowly taking material off and leaving a nice finish. So that's what I used. But you absolutely need to grind away that part of the transmission just a little bit, otherwise your engine will be very sad. This is the Scotch-Brite clean and strip disc I used, and here you can see the part of the transmission which I ground down. It's the region between the two uppermost mounting bolts. And then lastly, you will need new axles, and there are a couple of different styles that they use. The style that you need is, I believe they use them differently depending upon if it was a manual or an automatic, but it's the same style, different dimensions, but the same style as the one that you would have pulled off. It's a 6-bolt style here, as opposed to the other one they have, I believe, just slides into the transmission. It's held in tension, so there's no connection there, I believe. But you will need new drive axles, and the axle bolts should be replaced. They are torque to yield and extremely high torque. There are a couple of different, well, more than a couple, but there's a few different axle bolt styles that they've used over the years. More than likely you'll have a 12-point with no ribbing. So here you can see this is a smooth surface. They have some that have ribbing here. And if you have this style, the torque spec is 200 Newton meters plus 180-degree rotation, which you should do once the car is on the ground. But there are other styles as well. So I just wanted to note that that is the torque spec for this specific bolt.